Okay, so we are now on practical number 4, the vertebral column. So I will start and I might refer to the skeleton here, but I have the individual bones that you will need for this practical. So let's just start talking about cervical vertebrae and the characteristics of a cervical vertebra. Now all 3 of these are cervical vertebrae, and the reason I can tell is because they have these things called transverse foramen. These holes are not on any of the other vertebrae, the lumbar or thoracic, okay? So these are characteristic. They're usually smaller, but you can't characterize by size because every person is different. The characteristic of a cervical vertebra would be that they have these transverse foramen. You can see there's here, and also here and here. Okay, so there are 7 cervical vertebrae, the first 7. The very first 2 vertebrae are different from the others, and that's because your skull has to sit on something. So this right here would be the atlas, okay? You can see it's a cervical vertebra because it has these transverse foramen. It also has this vertebral foramen where your spinal cord will go through, okay? This is the axis, also a cervical vertebra because it has these 2 transverse foramen. It has our vertebral foramen. It's very, very different looking from the atlas, and it's also different looking from cervical vertebra 3 through 7. This would be cervical, an example of a regular cervical vertebra, either 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. Okay. You'll notice we're going to talk about different processes on here. So before I do that, I'm going to talk about the thoracic vertebrae. This is an example of a thoracic vertebra. You can see there are no transverse foramen. Normally, the process right here called the spinous process is a little bit longer and it looks kind of spinier, and I picked one that looks that way. They don't all look that way. Again, you can't categorize them that way. But what makes a thoracic vertebrae characteristic of one is it's kind of hard to see, but right here there are little facets, and on every one it's kind of hard to see. It depends on the specific vertebrae you find, and remember, these are models. So there's a little facet right in here. These are going to be for the articulation of your ribs. Remember, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae, so there are going to be 12 ribs, pairs of ribs that are going to articulate with your, your spinal column. Your ribs do not articulate with your sternum. You'll see the ribs, this is just a model, but the ribs connect with this costal cartilage before attaching to the sternum. So your ribs do not articulate here, they articulate back here on that facet that I just showed you that is a characteristic of a thoracic vertebra. Okay, so the last type of vertebra, the last 5, are going to be lumbar. So this is an example of a lumbar, and normally this is a body right here. It's really thick, and of course these vertebrae take the most of the brunt of your weight. So you see where they are right here. This is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So these are the 5 lumbar vertebrae. Okay. Generally, the characteristics, they don't have the facets. They generally have smaller, I call them wings sometimes, but these are called transverse processes. They're generally smaller than the other 2 vertebrae. So this kind of doesn't fall into the categories. So it is generally thicker as well. You can see how thick this is compared to one of these vertebrae, okay, or especially a cervical vertebrae. So the lumbar vertebrae are pretty darn big. Then we get to the sacrum. The sacrum looks like this, individual bones. These bones are in the box in the back of the room, closest to the door over there. I think it's the box right there. I know that's not relevant because it'll probably move. But anyway, this is located underneath these lumbar vertebrae. These are fused vertebrae. And then underneath that would be the sacrum. I don't have a sacrum loose. They're probably in the box somewhere, but this is the sacrum and this is the coccyx. This is your tailbone. Okay? So let's talk about these different, there's a lot of repeats in here. So I'm going to go through each one. Okay, so again, this is the transverse, these are the cervical vertebrae. So you can use any of these when you come up here and do the practical, but you need to have all of these vertebrae with you. Okay, so when we talk about the cervical vertebra, the transverse process would be where I'm holding on to right here. This is the transverse process of a cervical vertebra. So when you get that card, you would pick it up and just, or you could just point to it. Here it's very small on the atlas, on this side, and then on this side. Excuse me, this is the axis, my bad. This is the atlas, which is also the cervical vertebrae. It's C1, the first one. This is the transverse process, and on the other side, there's another transverse process. The spinous process on these is quite small. You can use this one. This is the spinous process of a cervical vertebra. Here's the vertebral foramen. Remember, the spinal cord goes through this bigger hole in the middle. So that's, remember, a foramen is a hole. And then, of course, the characteristic of a cervical vertebrae is these transverse foramen. We have them on both sides, here and here, on all cervical vertebrae. So if it doesn't have these holes, it's not a cervical vertebra. Okay? Then we have the superior and inferior facets. Remember what a facet is? A facet is a flat articular surface. So you have to know how these sit on top of each other. So I would definitely take a look at this video. Make sure you watch this video. This is C1. This is the atlas. It sits right on top of the axis. And then, of course, if you look at the skeleton, and you should look at the skeleton to see how they articulate, these would be the superior articular facets of this particular vertebrae. Underneath it, where it articulates with the, the vertebra underneath it or beneath it, these would be the inferior articular facets of a cervical vertebra. Okay? So now we're just going to repeat those on the other vertebrae, but we aren't going to have the transverse foramen because there are no more vertebrae with transverse foramen. So this is thoracic vertebra. So we're going to start with the transverse processes, which I'm holding on to right now. These are the transverse processes of a thoracic vertebra. We have the spinous process I'm holding on to of the thoracic vertebra. We have the vertebral foramen. Okay, I'm sticking my finger in the vertebral foramen of the thoracic vertebra. And then the facets are a little bit different here. These are superior, where I have my fingers, and you'll see the flat surfaces right here. And then if you look underneath it, here are the inferior facets of a thoracic vertebra. You'll notice it's different than the cervical vertebra as far as location, but it's where they articulate with the vertebra above and below. So again, this would be the superior facets of a thoracic vertebra. Turn it upside down, you would find the inferior facets of a thoracic vertebra. Okay. Then we get to the lumbar vertebra, finally. The smaller transverse processes of the lumbar vertebra, the spinous process of the lumbar vertebra, the vertebral foramen, and you can see the repeats now, of a lumbar vertebra, and then the superior articular facets of a lumbar vertebra, and then the inferior facets of a lumbar vertebra. And finally, we have the body of a lumbar vertebra, and it's pretty darn big. Again, this is where discs are going to sit in between all of your vertebrae, but you can see how big the discs are down here, and you can see if you damage any of these discs, how much stress is going to be on these vertebrae at the bottom of your spine. That's it for practical number 4, the vertebral column.